Hello, and welcome to Adventures in Learning Design, a series of conversations about ideas, principles, research and practice, exploring how we can make learning more effective and more enjoyable, whether that's in the workplace, at school, at university or at home. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name is Tim Gifford.
And we're both co-founders of LearnJam, a digital learning agency and consultancy. Episode 9, Motivation. In this episode, Tim, Katie and I talk about why motivation is one of the most important learning design principles, but also one of the most difficult to design for. We talk about why developing intrinsic motivation is the key to unlocking learning in any learning product or learning experience, and why things like rewards and badges and punishments often don't work. We also discussed some of the theories of motivation in learning and how we've been putting them into practice in projects that we've been working on recently. And we also talk about some recent learning experiences that we've done ourselves that we found really motivating. And we try and uncover what was going on there. What were the learning design decisions that were made that made those courses or those experiences so successful for us? So let's head over to Adventures in Learning Design HQ and have a listen. We are once again joined by Katie Asprey, who we spoke to all the way back in episode 5.
Lifetime ago.
It was a long time ago, back in those days of long evenings and sunshine. In this episode, we are going to be having a chat about motivation, particularly intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, what that means for learning design and what we can do to improve motivation in order to help people learn better. And our starting point for this is our learning design principles.
Yeah, so back in episode 3, we talked about our learning design principles, didn't we?
We did. And we talked through the 3 big principles that we identified that are based on the research into what works in learning.
Yes, so we have principle number 1 is design for the learner and their context. And number 2 is respond to what the learner already knows. And 3 is to provide effective practice over time.
Short, snappy, concise, memorable. So where does motivation fit into this?
So motivation is it's our very first principle. It's principle 1.1. I think we put it at the top of the principle pyramid because, in my opinion, it's definitely one of the most important principles and one of the most important, but also one of the most challenging to design well for.
Yeah. And it's a really frequent topic of conversation around learning as well, isn't it? Like, how do we motivate learners? What's the best way to motivate learners? How do you make a learning experience a motivational one, and so on?
Yeah, because and as we'll talk about a little bit more, intrinsic motivation is incredibly important for learning, but obviously a lot of what we learn both as at school and as adults is not inherently satisfying or fun in an immediate sense.
In an immediate sense, yeah. So Laurie, what is our position on motivation according to our principles?
I guess the basic position is that intrinsic motivation always trumps extrinsic motivation. So if the motivation comes from within, that is likely to lead to far more effective or better learning outcomes for all sorts of reasons. I think in this episode, in this conversation, we want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what's going on there, what that looks like, some of the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and some examples, and then think about what that means for learning design. So if we're saying that intrinsic motivation always trumps extrinsic motivation, so things like rewards and punishments, for example, what can we do in our learning experiences that we're designing that will build intrinsic motivation in learners, or at least move them away from or beyond simplistic rewards and punishments, the sort of most basic types of extrinsic motivation, which the evidence suggests doesn't really work.
Can you give me an example of like rewards that you've seen used?
Well, I guess the classic example that you see in lots of digital learning experiences would be things like badges.
The badge.
Leaderboards.
Leaderboards, yeah, that kind of stuff. Things that are not in any way related to what you're learning, but are kind of tacked on to the learning experience. If you get this score in this activity, you'll get a badge. that's completely unrelated to anything that you're doing or that you're trying to achieve.
You also talked about an extrinsic motivator in terms of punishments as well. Where do we see those playing out? What sort of punishments have we seen? Maybe we can rephrase that as like coercion and punishments, because coercion could be you kind of have to do this if you want to progress in your career, for example. Like, there's no way out of this. Like, you're going to have to go through this course, this class, to progress to the next stage in your career, for example. Or also sort of like inherent in that is, if you don't do this, you're not going to proceed or progress. Your future prospects are kind of dependent on you doing this thing, whether you like it or not. Is it tied up in that?
I would say it is. And I guess in my mind, that's less common, certainly in adult learning contexts, than fake rewards. But maybe, the perception of potential punishment or negative consequences through not doing something or completing a course, for example, is certainly very real. And certainly in formal education contexts in a lot of places, it is real. There are negative consequences to not getting a certain grade, for example, that people are painfully aware of. That's an extrinsic motivator, isn't it?
Just thinking back to it's not that long ago, my GCSE years. And that, looking back on it, that was very much how I was experiencing it. It's like the pressure and sort of like the push from the school, from the organisation, like from that institution, was like, your GCSEs are really important. You have to do this in order to do the next thing. Like, everything, like your future is dependent on the grades you get now. Well, it certainly wasn't intrinsically motivated, although there may have been a part of that in there somewhere. But like, it was very much a push. Like, you need to get through this for your future. Like, the reputation of the school, our rankings are all dependent upon how you perform here.
Yeah. Did you have any subjects that were intrinsically motivating that you just enjoyed in themselves?
Yeah, definitely. And those are probably the ones I actually probably got the lower grades in.
Right, let's scrap this episode.
I had, at high school, our schooling system, I came into high school when there was a bit of a split between what kind of classes you could take. So some of the classes that I could take, you got a grade, and it was achievement, merit, or excellence, or not pass. And then for some reason, I also took a stream of classes where it was just a pass or fail system. And in the classes where it was just a pass or fail, I often felt like I put in a lot more effort into those classes because I couldn't really see the grading system, and I wasn't told like if you're doing really well. But I developed more interest in those subjects.
That's interesting. So where it's like just a binary thing. You're not kind of being ranked. It's like either you've passed it or you haven't. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a really famous class at Stanford University, and I can't remember it's run by a professor called Laurie Santos, and she encourages her students to take, so there's an option within that class about whether you can see your grade system, so you can see A, B, C, D, done to fail, or you can just choose take the credit and take pass or fail. And she encourages her students just to take the pass or fail option so that they are more motivated, and she thinks that it contributes to their happiness when they don't see themselves ranked against each other or ranked against themselves.
That's really cool. Like a bit of agency as well, isn't it, around final outcome?
I think that she's reported that unfortunately most students, because of the nature of Stanford University, don't want to take that just simple credit system. They want to be able to see their grades evident on their transcripts.
That's really interesting.
That example is really interesting about taking the grades out of the equation, those sort of extrinsic factors. Let's bring it back to our learning design principles that we were talking about a few minutes ago. What have we suggested are some ways that you can help develop intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation in a learning experience?
Yeah, so in practice, I think we've pinned down a few ways to help develop intrinsic motivation. And they all relate back to self-determination theory and a couple of other psychological theories that we've used to underpin these principles. One of them is to provide opportunities for choice and self-direction so that learners can choose what's most interesting and relevant for them. Another one is to give positive feedback on performance so that learners feel a sense of progression and achievement and that their effort is worthwhile. And then the third one that we've got is to encourage learners to persevere in their efforts despite any setbacks, difficulties or failures by focusing them on their goals and their reasons for learning and tapping into their values of why they're learning what they're focusing on.
Just on that feedback point, the second point you raised there, Katie, Laura, you mentioned in the previous episode, didn't you? The sort of the dangers of the ego-based feedback.
Yay, great job, you're great.
Yeah.
Kind of feedback. There's research that suggests that can have a negative impact. And I think in terms of motivation, and what we're talking about here, it's feedback on performance that helps. Positive feedback on performance. So why did you do a good job there? Why was that good? Rather than just sort of empty slogans, as you said, sort of ego-based feedback, which can actually have a negative effect.
It's like, feedback on performance, but also progress as well, isn't it? Like as a result of doing that thing, you are now this much closer to your final objective, or you're now able to do these things better, or these things that you weren't able to do before. Like, look how you've changed as a result of doing this. It's not just, well done, you've completed Module 1.
Exactly,
It's like,
well,
you are now better.
Great job, here's a gold star. That's not what we want.
Yeah, I think that really feeds into the feeling of competence, or being able to sort of meet the challenges of your learning challenges, and being able to see through the feedback that you've made a step forward or progressed in what you're learning.
So it's a nice sort of combo, isn't it? It's like, I want to see, as a learner, I want to see how I've changed, how I've progressed, but also to have agency. And this is to the first point you mentioned, Katie, like providing opportunities for choice and self-direction, that I've got agency in how I change and progress. All these things coming together help really develop that sense of intrinsic motivation, rather than I'm told what to do, I'm told when it's done, and I'm told like how I did, whether I got it right or wrong. Yeah. So it all kind of feeds together. We've spent some time also, haven't we, thinking about products that we've used or interacted with that we think exemplify or demonstrate some of these principles.
Yeah, we thought it would be interesting and useful if we could think of some examples from our real lives that maybe demonstrate some of this. So it might be interesting to talk through a couple of those, and then we can come back to the theory.
Yeah.
Why did these things work for us? So I can kick it off. So the example that I went with when we were trying to think of examples from our real lives, it's an online course on mixing music production and mixing. And I chose it because the level of intrinsic motivation there for me personally is extremely high, because producing music is my hobby. It's what I've always most loved doing. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at this as an example of a course that I've taken that I actually completed. So a self-study online course that I finished and felt was a really successful experience, which I'm sure for anyone who has signed up to lots of self-study online courses or MOOCs is, that's a rare thing, right? So I thought, well, that's interesting. Why was it that one, I felt that it worked for me. I felt that I learned a lot and I actually completed it, and there was no danger at any point of me dropping out of that. I stayed interested, motivated, excited by it all the way through the whole thing. It's a kind of interesting example of intrinsic motivation. Like I said, the motivation was high to start with because of the subject itself is something that I was already deeply interested in. But then thinking about how the course works, it's the most basic course imaginable. It's a series of video lectures. It breaks so many rules of what I would say make for good learning design. You've got basically 8 video lectures. They're about 45 minutes long each. You've got a guy just talking and showing stuff for 45 minutes. That's it. So I would be saying, as a learning designer, that's terrible. You want to break those videos into much smaller chunks. You want to build in all sorts of activities and stuff within that. And there's loads of stuff you want to do that it doesn't do. But for me, the subject matter is interesting. And actually what it does is it does break it down. You are working alongside an expert. So he is in front of your very eyes mixing a music track, and you're doing it yourself on your own computer. And he breaks it down into really small steps. So this feeling of competence that he's developing, every single little step is like, yep, I can do that. Okay, he's shown me how to do it. Right, I'm going to do it. I've done it. I've achieved the same result as him. Great. And step by step, you get to the point where you've taken something that sounds, a song that sounds really terrible, through to something that sounds like a finished professional, publishable track. And through doing that, I learned how to do it. And that I could then apply that to other things. So, like I said, as that's my passion, that was naturally incredibly motivating. So the intrinsic motivation being there gave me the perseverance to see it through, and it wasn't a challenge to do that. But the way that the course broke down the subject matter into manageable chunks, so that I always felt I was kind of at the limits of my competence, but I had that regular, every few minutes, a sense of satisfaction that kind of made me want to keep going and move on to the next step. I thought it worked really well.
It sounds like the model there is kind of you sitting alongside or looking over the shoulder of an expert, isn't it? Like you were kind of just watching that engineer do what they did, and well, not just like passively watching. You had exactly the same tools, materials that he's using in the video. So you're kind of watching over their shoulder and are doing what he's doing as well. So it's like I'm actually mixing this song. I'm not just like seeing the principles and like the stages. It's like I'm going to be doing this as well. That seems quite powerful.
So basically it's a whole sequence of worked examples that you then put into practice yourself. So it's kind of, if you do break it down into what the learning design is, although ostensibly it's very basic, what you're actually getting is a sequence of very carefully managed worked examples with controlled practice and the less controlled practice, by the end of which you're sort of more autonomously able to put into practice what you've learned to do.
And we're going to put links to Laurie's tracks at the bottom of this podcast.
Give me a judge. Yeah, how amazing they sound. Awesome. Obviously, the jingle for this very podcast.
Well, there you go. Case in point.
It's a prime example.
Case in point. Look how good that is. Awesome.
That was my example. I think that's interesting because, like I said, the starting point there was a very high level of intrinsic motivation. And I think Tim and Katie, your examples are a little bit different in that the thing that you're doing in the course is less, or initially at least, less intrinsically motivating, but the products that you used kind of help to develop that, maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, something that I took up over lockdown that I think quite a few other people did with gyms and fitness centres and sports things closing is I started to try running. and yeah, I've never been much of a runner, but I started using the Nike running app, which another one of our colleagues is also, we also spoke about how we're using some fitness and wellness apps to try and build motivation around keeping fit. And analysing or having a look at this app and why, because I'm quite proud of myself now. I think it's been about 6 months of going for a couple of runs every week, which is a big difference for me. Just trying to break down why I keep using this app and why I keep coming back to it and looking at some of the features. And I mean, one of our principles is around providing opportunities for choice and self-direction. And one of the cool things about this app is that you can kind of choose any kind of run that you want. So every time that you come in, you can think about like, what do I feel like doing today? Do I want to do I don't want to, these are the titles of the runs, I don't want to run, or it's a rainy day run, or just like fast 5K run. So there's a lot of opportunity for choice. All of the runs are guided audio, and they use a lot of techniques like rational encouragement to help you persevere. So kind of saying things like, you've already run 2K, you've only got 2K more to go. So yes, some other things like positive affirmations of, I think we talked about this in the last episode that I was on, about reframing your experience in real time. So saying things like, you can do this, and trying to remind you sort of why you're running. Again, it's just to help get you over the finish line.
Yeah.
I love the idea of choosing the sort of run you want to do today. I don't want to run. Is a great, but it shows that product or the people behind that have clearly thought about what it's like to be in that position. like
exactly,
you don't jump out of bed wanting to run. You're kind of going through these obstacles. You're trying to get over those obstacles of actually getting your trainers on and getting out for a bit of exercise. That's really cool.
Yeah, I presume, Katie, that prior to doing this, that running itself was not something that you found particularly intrinsically motivating.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
It would have been the last thing on my list of things to do on a Saturday morning.
So I think that's a big difference, isn't it, between that example and my example. The course that I took had an easy job, really, because it's like I really wanted to learn how to do this because I enjoyed doing it. And it was a case of helping me to feel that sense of competence and mastery, sort of by breaking that down into manageable chunks. Whereas I think in your example, it is a case of like, here's a thing that I don't enjoy. And this
here's a thing that I'm not. I'm not a runner. I'm not. This is someone that I'm not. And now it's this process has turned me into, and through all of these techniques and features has turned me into like this is something that you do now.
Yeah.
This has like sort of been encompassed into my personality.
It's an identity shift, isn't it? You know, identify
Yeah.
as someone who runs. Yeah. Yeah, the product I kind of looked at as I guess exemplification of some of these principles was what's Noom, like a lifestyle and dieting and fitness app. And the reason I kind of picked this one up as an example was that it speaks to the last sort of sub-principle that you shared, Katie, which is around, you know, the need to encourage learners to persevere in their efforts despite setbacks. This is something that I thought that Noom does really, really well. Similar to you, Laurie, you know, I was kind of already intrinsically motivated to pick up Noom and get started. You know, I'm rapidly approaching a milestone birthday, which caused me to kind of reassess some of my health and fitness.
You don't look like you're nearly 21, Tim, but it's amazing.
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, that kind of prompted me to reassess some of my, you know, my health status and weight and all that sort of stuff. You know, I felt that's something I wanted to do, and I was kind of motivated to do that. But what I thought Noom did really well was kind of coached me through. Well, first of all, it showed awareness of like how difficult it is to start building a practice around tracking your weight, watching your diet, watching what you eat. It showed a level of awareness around that I hadn't really seen in other programs. And it had conversations with me, particularly around one daily habit it was trying to instill, which was, you know, the first thing you do every day is just weigh yourself. Just get used to stepping on the scales and weighing yourself, to start just keeping track and being aware that, you know, you're not going to see a huge difference day by day, but like over a number of days, you'll start seeing some benefits. You know, it kind of recognized that there's going to be a blocker or an obstacle to building that habit. And it did it through some really sort of clever, or actually some really sort of quite explicit, like psychological tips. It kind of talked through the blocker that I was experiencing. It gave some very human-centered, humorous approaches to helping me kind of reframe that anxiety around stepping on the scales. And basically through that helped me to overcome that obstacle, that anxiety. It also achieved something beyond that. It wasn't just about that habit of stepping on the scales. Like, I started to realize that the more I spent time with Noom, like the more I was actually building or encountering strategies and tools for overcoming anxieties more generally. Like, I was building more self-awareness around how I responded to obstacles outside of just health and wellness. So that was something that I found more motivation in. Like, it wasn't just around health. It was around, I'm actually becoming more like resilient in how I encounter and deal with problems, for example, which is really interesting. So yeah, that's something that I felt kind of spoke really nicely to this idea of like helping learners, in that case me, like persevere, overcome obstacles, but also kind of achieve something else. And to your point, Katie, like I started to identify as somebody outside of the health and wellness activities, like somebody who was just a bit more self-aware, somebody who kind of knew how their mind worked when encountering obstacles and that they were able to do something about them. So it kind of shifted.
Bit of metacognition
there.
Man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I love it when products do that, when it's the conversation is no longer about that thing, but it's about like you. I thought that worked really well in that particular instance.
So, Tim, what are some of the specific things that product did? So what did the designers of Noom do that made it have that effect on you?
Yeah, well, one thing is it's very conversational. So like the messaging, the conversation in the app is very human-centered. It's very lighthearted. It's really fun. It's not heavy. It's not trying to persuade or like cajole you into doing something. It's all very humorous and playful, which I thought it just sets the tone really nicely. It also gave me an option to kind of choose or to reflect, or actually to tell the app like what I had doing, what I was thinking about, particularly in this instance, stepping on the scales. How was I feeling about it? So it gave me a chance to kind of like share how I felt about that particular habit. And it also then gave me very clear sort of psychological tips to reframe that particular problem or that particular obstacle. So like an opportunity to like feel heard, I suppose, and also like some very simple, more transferable, like psychological tips, tricks, strategies, that again kind of moved me away from just like looking at the scales on the floor to more like, why do I think about this as a blocker? Kind of moved me out of myself a little bit. And again, it does that in a very conversational way, in a very playful way, very light touch sort of way.
Yeah. And did you get a badge for every kilo that you lost?
I don't think, I certainly haven't got... Yeah, I certainly haven't. You haven't earned them yet.
We got one yet.
But I don't think happened. But I think it's just like, it's just this accumulation, this build-up of like practice and behaviour. I think that's what it is. It's like, it's not about the weight going down. It's about the behaviours that you start demonstrating day to day. That's what was really attractive, and really that's what I felt I wanted to keep doing, like building on that behaviour. And like I said,
it sounds like it's kind of increasing your competence levels, so you can see your competence growing and increasing every day in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it was about. And like I said, I love it when that shift happens. Forget about your weight. Think about how you're building competences in other areas.
Maybe we should touch on some of the theory behind this that we looked at that I guess that informed this part of our learning design principles. So there's a couple of things in particular that it might be interesting to focus on. So one is self-determination theory, which Katie, you already mentioned earlier on. Could you give us a quick primer on that?
So self-determination theory is a theory of motivation, and it states that there are two types of motivation: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And that intrinsic motivation is underpinned or driven by three basic psychological needs that I think we've touched on when describing some of these products that we felt highly motivated by. So the three main needs are the need for autonomy, so to feel that your behavior is self-endorsed, that you're doing something willingly, that you have some control over your life or what you're doing or learning. The second one is the idea of competence, so the feeling that you're progressing, you're feeling able to meet the challenges of what you're learning, and that you can see yourself sort of moving forward. And I think that speaks to what we described before about giving positive feedback on performance, so that learners can feel a sense of progression and achievement, and that the effort is worthwhile. And then the last one is relatedness, or how relevant a learning activity is to your life, how you link what you're learning with your personal values and interests.
The examples that we gave all kind of strongly speak to that, don't they? And so those three things, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, they're kind of all interconnected as well, aren't they, I think? So, for example, competence alone won't really build intrinsic motivation without autonomy, for example. So unless you feel that this is something you've done or that's come from within, that feeling of competence won't really build intrinsic motivation.
I think that when all three of those needs are met is when intrinsic motivation is highest. And as learning designers, we kind of can focus on different parts of those and design features to encourage or increase a learner's feeling of autonomy, a learner's feeling of competence, and a learner's feeling of relatedness. But all three are really important for learning and intrinsic motivation.
So a project we're working on at the moment, we're looking at very deliberately bringing those three things together: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The product is an app for pre-university students who want to explore their own interests and passions, and in doing so start developing an understanding of what a particular profession or field of practice involves. So, for example, I think we've mentioned this in a previous episode, but for example, if I'm interested in sort of design and improving the world through design, I can learn design techniques and strategies and tools from a natural expert designer. So in that way, we kind of wanted to give this sense of like relatedness, that, we wanted the learners to be driven by and to explore the product by what really interested them, what was relevant to them, what drove them in terms of passions and interests and so on. And also we built in this idea of autonomy by allowing them to choose their way through it. So it wasn't just a set program, but you can kind of choose to follow or learn from or encounter different experts depending on whatever you want to do at that given day, right? So I could spend some time over here learning about design tips and strategies, and then the next day flip and start learning from a professional networker about how they connect with people all around the world to open up new opportunities for business, etc. So I can really kind of discover my own way through it. I have like total autonomy over how I experience that program. And in doing so, I'm building competence. We wanted the learners to build competence in terms of soft skills like self-awareness, critical thinking, creativity, initiative, and so on. So we can actually show them, look, through doing that design playlist and encountering what it's like to be a designer, you are developing creativity, critical thinking skills, you're developing an actual very real hard skill of like drawing and observation, for example. Like all these things are developing, and what we wanted to do was to kind of expose that in a way that you weren't aware that was happening to you, but that whole design conversation we had with you was around critical thinking. Look how you are now a critical thinker in a way that you weren't before. So that's one example, I think, of how we try to bring those three dimensions together: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
And in that product, Tim, how do you deal with external rewards and punishments? Are there any sort of grades, or do students have to submit assignments?
They submit assignments, but it's only for the benefit of themselves and their peers, right? So like, look at the work I've done in that design playlist. I want to share it with you for feedback, to compare, with the view that, you know, maybe I can take something away from sharing it with you that allows me to improve on it. But we haven't built in anything like grades or badges or anything like that. It's not about pass or fail. It's about the journey, like what happens to you in the process of going through that program. That you are accruing these soft skills, developing in dimensions, like in senses of self that you perhaps weren't aware of, for example. So yeah, we try to dial back the external motivators. Like there's no sort of like expectation or drive, or like, we wanted it to really come from within, something that you're interested in, something you're passionate about and see value in doing.
Is the expectation that the learners in this case are already interested in this, that there's an initial intrinsic motivation, i.e. like me with the music production course, or is it that the product is seeking to develop that
bit of both
motivation from a lower base?
Bit of both. So like, start by exploring something that you're interested in, and there's a range of things for you, right? So we wanted to make sure that it's really clear that there's no singular starting point. So the starting point is what interests you, whether that is improving the world through design, whether it's caring for people, whether it is making new discoveries. Like, we wanted to make sure that your starting point was your own sort of personal sense of purpose, passion, whatever it is. But through exploring those, we wanted to make sure that you were exposed to things that were kind of related to that. You know, you could sort of expose or discover like perhaps new interests. So through the design sequence of lessons and activities, maybe you start developing an interest around specifically drawing, for example, and let's explore that thing. Or maybe through the health sequence in that program, you may be starting to developing an interest around like research and analysis. Let's go in that direction. So yeah, the assumption is you can see your interest in the product, and you can see a way of exploring that. But in doing so, that can lead to other avenues and other things that you can start exploring of yourself. So very much autonomous.
I would love to be a learner on that product, just based on the fact that it sounds like you have so much autonomy over what you're learning, and you can choose and direct your own learning path. I'm thinking now of all the other products that we've worked on, where learners are not so lucky in that they can choose what they're learning and choose what to focus on, and they have these, have been told by an employer or by an educator that you must complete this course. And what strategies we've implemented to help foster or develop intrinsic motivation in those situations.
That's all well and good, but like, as an employer, I need you to like learn about our new guidelines, for example. Like, there's not a great deal of scope for autonomy there. Like, I need you to be cyber secure and to go through these things and demonstrate competence and awareness and behaviors in that area. How do we manage that when it's, as we said, competence, relatedness and autonomy facilitate intrinsic motivation, but can a learner always be autonomous when there are like key outcomes that need to be achieved?
Yeah, and can something always become intrinsically motivating? There are certain things that you need to learn to be able to do that are just not going to be intrinsically motivating. There's not going to be inherent satisfaction in that work or that task, but you still need to learn to do it. So what can we as learning designers do to at least move it as close to intrinsically motivating as we can? I think in some instances there's a limit to how far you can go with autonomy, but I think the goal as a learning designer is what can we do to build competence, autonomy and relatedness? Maybe think about those three things together. So how can we help the learner relate this to their real lives really deeply, for example? How can we break it down so that they are constantly feeling a sense of mastery or competence, of breaking into small manageable chunks with positive feedback on performance? And then what can we do to build autonomy? To what extent can we give the learner choices and the freedom to choose the direction they go in, or what particular task they focus on, or how they implement this concept into their work? So maybe thinking of those three things holistically Rather than think, there are situations where autonomy is hard. As a learning designer, there's only so much you can do. But we have 3 dimensions here: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So what can we do to really push those 3 together as far as we can in the learning design? Pragmatically, maybe that's how I tackle that challenge.
One way to increase a learner's sense of autonomy is by sort of downplaying or reducing the pressure or the focus on grades, and to encourage learners to sort of internalize why they're learning something, and to kind of try and integrate that with their own value system or reasons for learning. Yeah, so I guess, you want to remove the focus on grades and emphasize sort of the relevance and the value of what you're learning, and how those skills are going to benefit either you later in your life, and how they sort of feed into your sort of wider value system. So like, for example, maybe if you were studying medicine, then you might have a number of different motivators that are feeding into why you're doing this. And at the lowest level, it might be because you're studying medicine, or you're studying this degree and you only just want to pass or fail. And that would be sort of an external motivator, a carrot and stick kind of situation of reward and punishment. I passed or failed. And then maybe the next level up would be that you are studying to become a doctor in order to show your worthiness, your worthiness to your family, like you have family pressures. That's why you want to enter the field of medicine. But then as you kind of get further up that ladder, you can tap into different reasons of why you're studying. And I think that's what we want to do as learning designers, is to tap into those things. If I'm studying to become a doctor in order to be able to help people, or in order to be able to in order to help those in need, which is consistent with my wider values.
I am somebody who helps people.
So I'm learning this in order to be the person that I want to be.
Yeah, so I guess when we're designing learning experiences, some techniques that we've used in the past is by helping people to recognize sort of those future possible selves that they can be, and then building in opportunities to reflect throughout the course on that vision of what they're aiming for in the long term.
So Katie, I guess you've segued nicely into the second piece of research that we wanted to talk about.
Dornier's ideal selves, future selves theory, isn't it?
This theory is the idea that the vision of who students want to become is a really reliable factor of long-term learning behaviour. And so if you can build a vision, and by vision I mean imagery, it's more than a goal of being able to imagine and feel yourself completing an activity, and feel those emotions and those senses around reaching that goal, then you're more likely to continue learning and have a higher sense of motivation.
So like drawing a very tangible, or as tangible as possible, connection between current self and ideal future self. So like I can kind of feel what it's like to be that ideal self, where successful, competent, etc. Like I can kind of get a sense of what that person does, how they feel, how they operate, what they say, what they think. And that's something that I can keep in my mind throughout. So it's like, it's very like a direct line, that future self. Yeah, and something, again, we use in that product that I mentioned, that sort of one, the way we're building in autonomy, competence and relatedness. And we use experts in those fields to kind of set those up. So in design, you learn from an expert designer. You see, or you hear and see somebody talking to you from a position of like competence, that kind of future self is really clearly projected, and they're sharing with you like, this is what I do, this is what I say, this is my practice when I do this day in, day out. So it helps the learner to like focus in on, and not have to like construct a visualization, but like see like exactly what that's like to be that, to be operating in that mode. And it was, it's this kind of future self theory that we were shooting for there, like give them a very clear sense of, this is a really good target for you. Or this is a really good example of somebody who's really successful in this field, in this area of interest for you. So let's make that really clear.
Yeah, I think that the use of role models is a really powerful way of inspiring learners. I mean, it gives them something tangible to sort of hang their vision or of their future selves on, because I think you need to, in order for your future self to work as a motivator, it has to be plausible. So if you have a role model that you can aspire to, then that really helps. It has to be elaborate and vivid, so you can see somebody in that position doing what you want to do. Yeah, and it has to be relevant as well. So if this is something that you can see yourself doing in your life, that's really important.
Laura, do you think that's what was happening to you when you were doing your mixing course? Like seeing that person at the desk talking through it was like, I can totally visualize, and not just visualize, but like I can see how what I'm doing here is building towards that level of competence and mastery.
Good question. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, the future self concept there. But yeah, I think so. Not necessarily the guy doing the course was someone I aspired to be. Primarily because he's a Christian rock musician, and that's not
a genre that you're particularly
not my thing.
into.
But yeah, it's not my personal choice of genre. Yeah, nothing against it. But yeah, I guess in terms of the skills, what he was able to demonstrate that he could do, yes, absolutely. Like I said, I don't think it's a role model situation there necessarily, but it's definitely a case of like there's a vision of a future me that has this expertise and is able to craft great sounding music really easily and effectively. That was definitely very strong, and I think that that's part of the intrinsic motivation. Our starting point for this was, what if someone needs to learn something that is not particularly intrinsically motivating for them to start with? And we talked about that sort of combination of competence, autonomy and relatedness coming from self-determination theory, and then this ideal future self concept from the research by Dornier. It feels like there's quite a sort of a powerful combo there of different things that can help as a learning designer that you can use to help you sort of craft the learning experience to try and move a learner from an initial starting point of maybe complete lack of intrinsic motivation through to at least some sort of internalized extrinsic motivation where, okay, I'm doing this, I want to be doing this, I understand why I'm doing this, what this means for me, and where this is going to take me. And that by doing that, you have a chance of making that learning experience significantly more motivating for that learner. Therefore, they're more likely to stick with it and to see it through, especially when things get tough. Because that's the thing, if you're not motivated, you will just drop out.
Learning's hard, man.
It is, yeah.
It ain't easy, but like developing that intrinsic motivation is really going to help with that. Sticking, isn't it? Sticking with it.
Adventures in Learning Design was brought to you by LearnJam.
To learn more about what we do and who we do it for, and to download your own free copy of our learning design principles, head over to learnjam.com.